27-year-old Tessa Whitlock moved through the exclusive private dining suite of a high-end Chicago establishment, balancing a heavy serving tray. Her hands bore the rough calluses of back-to-back shifts. Her rich auburn hair was pinned up in a rushed knot, and her steady gray eyes were naturally inclined toward the floor. Not out of timidity, but from a lifelong habit of observing the world rather than seeking its attention. For 4 quiet years, she had served coffee with absolute punctuality, cleared her tables flawlessly, and kept her personal life an absolute mystery to everyone around her. Consequently, her colleagues labeled her the arrogant snob in the scuffed shoes. None of them ever cared to discover that every Wednesday night, the moment the restaurant doors locked, she hurried across town to a sign language class at a local community center, determined to maintain a bridge of communication with her younger brother, whose hearing had been severely impaired by a childhood illness years earlier. That was precisely why, when the resentful shift supervisor named Brett deliberately chose her to wait on the establishment's most intimidating patron that Thursday evening, she immediately recognized the unspoken malice in the air. As a knowing smirk rippled through the staff, Tessa noticed the predatory gleam in their eyes. They had already neatly categorized her without ever bothering to know her. The guest occupying the private room was Salvatore Marquetti. At 33, he possessed a commanding, broad-shouldered frame, his sleek dark hair brushed back and punctuated by premature silver streaks at his temples. A subtle scar cut down his left cheek, and his unmoving gaze carried a chilling stillness. The entire establishment whispered about his absolute control over the West Side underworld, noting his routine of arriving entirely alone every Thursday night to sit in isolation, leaving massive tips, and never uttering a single word to the staff. Rumors claimed he was merely a narcissistic tyrant who feigned deafness, as a power play to appear superior. This rumor formed the foundation of the cruel trap Brett and his inner circle had orchestrated. They intentionally forced their most impoverished waitress into that lion's den, then gathered gleefully behind the service doors, eagerly waiting to see the powerful boss utterly ignore her until she broke down and fled the room in absolute disgrace. What the scheming onlookers failed to realize was the absolute truth. Salvatore wasn't playing a game. The devastating blast that had claimed his father's life 15 years ago had permanently taken his hearing as well. He navigated his world entirely by reading the lips of anyone who stood before him, guarding this vulnerability with fierce intensity. In his treacherous line of work, an exposed weakness was an immediate death sentence. When Tessa stepped up to place her tray down, her lips moved as she read the evening's specials, only to be met with total, unyielding silence. She paused for a heartbeat, processing the stillness. Yet instead of fracturing, under the immense pressure, just as her watching coworkers were desperately hoping she would, she looked directly into his icy eyes, raising her weathered hands with calm deliberation. She began to form slow, precise gestures. "Good evening. I will be taking care of your table tonight. May I take your order?" For the first time in over a decade, a complete stranger was communicating with Salvatore Marquetti in the silent language of his own world. The infamous syndicate leader's head lifted instantly. That legendary frozen gaze cracked completely, revealing the human being beneath. Meanwhile, peeking through the service door's narrow pane, 3 smirking faces suddenly contorted into deep bewilderment, entirely unable to decode the rhythmic movement of those hands. The petty trap they had set to break a defenseless girl had dissolved completely, leaving them deeply aggravated and intensely focused on watching her every move in the coming weeks. They remained completely oblivious to the fact that this single interaction was the genesis of a connection that would eventually silence every single one of them. If you believe that a person's worth should never be treated as another group's cheap entertainment, please hit that like button to help this narrative reach others. Share this video with someone who needs an uplifting reminder today, and remember to subscribe so you never miss our next inspiring journey. The momentous encounter in the private dining room eventually drew to a close. Fading back into the routine of another grueling shift, Tessa unfastened her uniform apron as midnight approached, walking out into the gentle Chicago drizzle toward her usual bus stop. She watched the glowing city lights blur behind the condensation of the bus, window all the way to the south side. Her modest one-room apartment was located on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building where the stairwell perpetually carried a damp scent in the hallway. Light bulb flickered constantly, despite the landlord's empty promises to replace it 2 winters ago. She turned her key in the lock with extreme caution, knowing her younger brother Dany would already be fast asleep. The 22-year-old had left the small desk lamp illuminating the kitchen counter, leaving a brief handwritten note resting beside a small pot of rice, letting her know he had put away a meal for her. The letters were slightly uneven and hurried, but the sight of them made her linger in the cramped kitchen for a quiet moment. After a relentless day, surrounded by people who looked straight through her as if she were nothing more than utilitarian. Restaurant furniture, that simple piece of paper served as her solitary reminder that she was a human being, someone who mattered to someone waiting at home. Dany's partial hearing. Loss had occurred in the wake of a severe childhood, fever when he was only 7 years old, an event that had long since drifted into their shared past. Neither of the siblings viewed the silence as an open trauma anymore. It was simply a quiet companion they had gracefully adapted to live alongside. It was entirely for his sake that Tessa had initially gathered the courage to walk into those introductory sign language sessions. Her early attempts had been clumsy and rigid, with every hand gesture feeling painfully unnatural, until gradually that wordless vocabulary transformed into the sacred channel through which they shared the profound truths that spoken words could never quite convey. She still vividly recalled the rush of pure joy she felt the very first time. Dany completely understood a complex sentence she signed, breaking out into a bright, resonant laugh. It was a sound unlike any other in the world. From that definitive moment onward, she recognized that the most meaningful connections frequently required no vocalization at all. Their mother had passed away years before after a grueling, protracted battle in a hospital ward, while their father sought solace for his grief at the bottom of a bottle, eventually walking out the door one afternoon and never returning. Tessa rarely shared these chapters of her history with anyone. This reservation didn't stem from a sense of shame, but rather from a hard-earned understanding that any piece of her vulnerability she surrendered to the world could easily be weaponized by others to define and limit her. Consequently, she locked those memories away like forgotten documents at the bottom of a storage drawer. Tucked away in that same drawer were the lingering medical debts from her mother's illness, balances she faithfully chipped away at with small monthly payments. Those mounting numbers existed like a permanent shadow following her steps, but she had grown so accustomed to its presence that she refused to let it break her posture. She simply resolved to work her 2 shifts, collect her hard-earned tips, and keep moving forward. Her complete avoidance of the usual post-shift socializing and late-night bar hangouts only served to intensify the kitchen staff's active resentment, solidifying her status as an isolated outsider who refused to integrate. Not a single coworker bothered to consider how someone who clocked out at midnight only to return to the floor early the next morning could possibly find the spare hours or the extra finances for such superficial indulgences. They observed her quiet reserve and quickly labeled it as icy arrogance, whereas the absolute reality was that Tessa possessed an incredibly warm heart. She was merely being fiercely protective of herself. There had been a time in her youth when she trusted someone unconditionally, and that singular mistake had taught her a devastating lesson she was determined never to repeat. Maintaining an intentional distance wasn't an act of superiority. It was her fundamental strategy for emotional survival, a protective wall constructed not to shut humanity out, but to defend the tender, unbruised spaces remaining within her soul. That evening, she sat quietly at her small kitchen table, slowly consuming the cold portion of rice Dany had thoughtfully set aside for her. As the minutes stretched out into a profound quiet, her thoughts felt unusually crowded. All through the long transit home, her mind kept drifting back to the striking gaze of the man in the private room, while the entire restaurant establishment whispered that his eyes were devoid of humanity. She had glimpsed something entirely different the moment she lifted her hands to speak his language. She couldn't fathom why Brett had maliciously selected her for that specific room, nor did she have any idea that 3 mocking faces had been huddled behind the doorframe, waiting for her emotional collapse. She only knew that for a handful of fleeting minutes, a powerful stranger had looked at her not as an invisible servant, but as an actual person. That realization, though she was still too hesitant to openly name it, acted like a warm beam of light, penetrating the thick fortress she had spent years building. After cleaning her plate, she washed the dishes, darkened the apartment, and stood quietly by the window pane, watching the rain-soaked streets reflect the amber glow of the city street lamps. She firmly reminded herself that tomorrow would be identical. She would arrive exactly on time, wipe down her assigned tables, and remain completely guarded. Yet even as she asserted this defense, she felt a subtle internal shift occurring, like a heavy door, turning slightly on its hinges, before anyone had consciously decided to unlock it. Wednesday evening arrived, marking the solitary night of the week when Tessa permitted herself to step completely outside the relentless grind of her double shifts. It was the night she journeyed to her sign language course, held at a modest community center tucked away on a serene Southside Avenue. The classroom was a weathered space filled with simple plastic chairs, arranged in a neat circle, facing a whiteboard permanently stained with ghost images of old marker ink. To Tessa, however, this humble room was an absolute sanctuary where she could finally breathe freely. The class was guided by an exceptional deaf instructor named Mrs. Adeline, who rejected the idea of teaching sign language as a mere sequence of memorized physical movements. Instead, she introduced it as a living, breathing language rich with subtle nuance, emotional depth, and intentional pauses. Mrs. Adeline frequently communicated through her hands that our fingers often possess the courage to speak the deep truths that the throat instinctively suppresses. That profound sentiment resonated deeply with Tessa, capturing her internal reality far more accurately than she would ever care to admit out loud. This path wasn't a choice born out of casual curiosity or a desire for a hobby. It was a vital lifeline constructed in the quiet wake of her brother's profound childhood diagnosis, the only remaining bridge capable of spanning the growing chasm of his silence. Tessa, who was just a child herself at the time, had stood outside her brother's room and recognized a terrifying truth. If she failed to forge a new way to communicate with Dany, the emotional distance between them would widen with every passing year. That terrifying isolation frightened her far, more than the grip of poverty or the exhaustion of sleepless nights. Upon entering her apartment, she found Dany still awake at the small table, meticulously working on technical blueprints for his vocational trade course. Sensing her arrival, he lifted his head and signed a question inquiring how her evening class had gone. Tessa slid into the chair opposite him, but rather than offering her usual summary of the lesson, she used her hands to narrate the extraordinary encounter with the restaurant patron who had unexpectedly understood the unique language they shared. Dany's eyebrows arched with immediate curiosity. A bright smile spread across his face as he began to playfully tease her through signs, noting that someone else in the world could finally decipher her thoughts exactly the way he did. Tessa joined in his laughter, a rare, genuine sound that echoed through the small space. Yet, even within the safety of that comforting moment, she had absolutely no way of knowing that the Thursday evening encounter, which felt so entirely accidental, had actually been a calculated trap, and that her malicious coworkers were watching her interactions with an agenda she had yet to uncover. As the subsequent Thursday evenings in that private room evolved into a predictable routine, the initial tension of their introductory meeting completely dissolved into an incredibly natural connection. The imposing man seated at the head of the long table no longer regarded her as an anonymous server, just as she no longer perceived him as a menacing enigma. He would lower his glass with deliberate slowness, and with each passing week, their dialogues unfolded with organic ease. Every gesture he made was executed with absolute certainty, characteristic of someone who had inhabited silence long enough to transform it into an elegant extension of his own physical presence. Tessa, who had initially trembled with anxiety, now found herself conversing with total freedom. She shared the truth of her past, explaining that her fluency had been born out of a deep desire to communicate with her younger brother, who inhabited a world with far less sound than everyone else. Salvatore received her story with a refreshing absence of pity, bypassing the hollow, performative sympathy that well-meaning people typically offered whenever such personal narratives arose. She vividly recalled how he had signed during one of their foundational evenings together, assuring her that she had entered his room to provide service, not to be utilized as a helpless piece in someone else's petty game. A profound statement that made her realize the man before her possessed a mind far sharper than the ruthless, cold persona the restaurant staff endlessly gossiped about over their dinner shifts. She would gracefully sign the evening's culinary offerings, and on one particular occasion, when she casually mentioned that the soup might have lost some of its heat because it had lingered a bit too long on the kitchen line, he merely arched a single eyebrow. His hands responded with a brilliant flash of dry wit. He reminded her that he couldn't hear the chaotic din of the city anyway, so if a bowl of lukewarm soup chose to murmur a complaint, that would completely escape him as well. Meaning they were perfectly even, A spontaneous laugh escaped Tessa's lips before she could think to suppress it. It was the first genuine, unburdened laugh she had allowed herself to experience within those workplace walls in countless months. She had never anticipated that an underworld figure everyone trembled to look at would possess such a dry, understated sense of humor beneath his stoic facade. That shared moment of amusement acted like a pebble dropped into a perfectly still lake, rippling the space between them. He watched her smile emerge, and the intense frost in his eyes visibly softened, revealing that his legendary coldness was merely a protective armor forged from a lifetime of being surrounded by people who never bothered to truly communicate with him. The routine table service that was technically supposed to conclude within 5 minutes, merely recording his selections and retreating, now consistently expanded into much longer blocks of time. He inquired about her younger brother's progress, asking about his trade curriculum, and she provided carefully measured insights, offering just enough to be polite while guarding her boundaries. Salvatore then signed a poignant observation, noting that the vast majority of individuals who found themselves across from him chose to speak with exaggerated volume and agonizing slowness, as if sheer decibels could miraculously cure a lack of hearing. Worse still, many would completely bypass him, addressing their remarks solely to the associates at his side as if he weren't even a living presence in the room. Tessa tracked the movement of his fingers with absolute concentration, realizing with a sudden pang that the marginalization he was describing perfectly mirrored her own daily experience within the restaurant, the agonizing sensation of being physically present yet completely looked through. Two distinct strangers inside an isolated room had unexpectedly discovered a shared reality far more expansive than the physical mechanics of sign language, a mutual understanding shared by two human beings who were entirely accustomed to being stared at, but never truly seen. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the heavy wooden door, where a tiny seam opened up toward the dim service hallway, the 3 coworkers who had anticipated a single evening of humiliating theater found their frustration intensifying with each passing week. They had gathered near the doorframe with mocking grins, eagerly anticipating the poor girl's tearful exit. Instead, as the Thursdays rolled by, their eyes were forced to witness an entirely different reality. 2 pairs of hands moving in a flawless, conversational dance. The unmistakable laughter of a woman they were certain would be reduced to tears. And the focused, respectful attention of a formidable boss everyone assumed was incapable of warmth, anchored entirely on the movements of the server they had sent in as a joke. One of the kitchen staff nudged Brett silently. Without a word, the group disintegrated one by one, retreating down the service corridor while carrying the bitter, burning resentment unique to small-minded individuals who have orchestrated a public execution only to watch the script permanently slip completely away from them. Inside the quiet room, Tessa remained entirely oblivious to the malicious audience that had just dispersed into the shadows. She only knew that time seemed to operate under a strange, accelerated rule set whenever she was in his presence. When she finally stepped back out into the main dining floor to resume her duties, she had no inkling that the evening she classified as just another routine shift had fundamentally altered something massive, not only within her own heart, but also within the inner world of a man everyone believed had permanently barricaded himself away from humanity at the dark end of the corridor. The profound sense of validation and comfort she discovered within that private suite accompanied Tessa through the remainder of her duties. She carried heavy trays, cleared tables, and sanitized the countertops with a renewed vitality she hadn't experienced in years. Her mind continuously echoed with the memory of her own laughter and the striking way Salvatore had regarded her as an actual human being rather than an invisible shadow. However, that fleeting sense of happiness, as she would bitterly learn, was destined to shatter the exact moment she descended into the damp dishwashing area located behind the main kitchen line to organize the final collection of serving trays before clocking out for the night. There, effectively hidden by the towering rows of industrial stainless steel dish racks and the roaring hum of the water jets, Brett and Carla were huddled together sharing a low laugh. Because they were entirely unaware of her quiet approach, the words they exchanged were completely unvarnished and brutal. Carla was drying her hands on a towel, giggling as she confessed. She had fully expected the quiet, Sniper to freeze like a statue before bursting into tears and running from the room. Who could have possibly predicted this outcome? Brett let out a sharp, deeply bitter laugh, muttering that their entire elaborate plan had been completely derailed. He complained bitterly that week after week, they had squandered their time hovering outside the door seam, waiting to witness her make an absolute fool of herself, in front of that stone-deaf monster, only to walk away empty-handed. Hearing those casual, mocking sentences slice through the air, the agonizing reality of that initial Thursday night pierced Tessa's consciousness with devastating clarity. Every perplexing detail suddenly locked into a cohesive, ugly picture, the sneering expressions, the sudden change in table assignments, and their calculated silence. She had never been handed a challenging table by mere coincidence. She and an unsuspecting patron had been served up as a cheap piece of circus, entertainment designed solely for her coworkers' twisted amusement. Tessa stood completely paralyzed behind the metal shelving, the heavy stack of trays still gripped firmly in her hands. She felt the beautiful warmth that had filled her chest only moments prior begin to instantly freeze, souring into a thick, suffocating bitterness. Like a pristine thing left exposed to a toxic atmosphere until it ruined completely before it could ever be rescued. Yet what caused the deepest ache within her, strangely enough, wasn't the realization that she had been transformed into a punchline. She was entirely accustomed to being dismissed, entirely used to eyes looking straight through her as if she were a piece of wood, a cruel joke directed at her own expense was something she possessed the strength to absorb and let slide, just as she had absorbed countless injustices throughout her life. What truly turned her blood cold and ignited a fierce, slow-burning fire within her soul was the realization that they had dragged Salvatore into their malice without considering his humanity for even a fraction of a second. They threw around the phrase stone-deaf monster with an amused, mocking cadence, as though his inability to hear were a hilarious defect designed for their personal amusement. They had taken the most vulnerable, deeply guarded facet of his life, the very secret he was forced to protect, with his life, and used it as raw material for a cheap, high school performance. Tessa's thoughts instantly flew to Dany. She remembered the fierce battles she had fought every single day of her life to ensure her sweet brother would never be reduced to a cruel joke simply because he navigated a world with fewer acoustic frequencies. She realized with absolute, chilling certainty that if she hadn't possessed the ability to sign that fateful night, a completely blameless man would have been left stranded in a painful, silent isolation, targeted by a wave of systematic cruelty he couldn't even hear coming. That horrifying realization made her grip the edges of the metal tray so fiercely that her knuckles turned completely white. She chose not to step out from her hiding spot. She didn't raise her voice. She refused to grant Brett and Carla the satisfaction of knowing she had intercepted their dialogue, recognizing that unleashing her fury in that moment would only devolve into a chaotic, loud argument that would eventually dissipate without changing a single thing. She silently deposited the trays on a counter, spun around, and during the entire long journey back to her apartment that night, the comforting laughter from the private suite was completely gone from her mind. It was replaced by a single haunting question that reverberated through her thoughts. How many times in this life were people entirely willing to butcher another human being's fundamental dignity for a moment of cheap amusement, simply because they assumed the victim would remain oblivious to the blade, and more importantly, could she truly continue to walk away in silence, just as she had always walked away from everything else? Throughout the entirety of the following week, Tessa harbored that quiet, intense fury like a sharp stone, tucked away in her apron pocket. Not heavy enough to crush her spirit entirely, but sharp enough that every single time her thoughts brushed against it, it caused a distinct sting. She maintained her flawless routine, arriving precisely on time, polishing the glassware, and keeping her internal world completely locked away. She had almost succeeded in convincing herself that the incident was merely another unpolished chapter of her life that would eventually fade away into the background, until the next Thursday evening arrived, and Salvatore walked through the entrance with his characteristic, commanding stride. This time, however, instead of silently moving directly toward the private suite at the far end of the hallway as he always did, he paused intentionally at the reception desk. Looking straight at Brett, he presented a brief, handwritten directive demanding by name the exact waitress from the previous week to handle his service, exclusively, stating no one else would be permitted in the room. Tessa watched the interaction from a few paces away and saw Brett's expression instantly morph, His habitual arrogant smirk dissolved completely, replaced by the distinct panic of a bully who suddenly realizes the trap he carefully engineered has snapped back in a direction he can no longer control. He cast a fleeting, anxious look her way before offering a rigid, submissive nod. Thus, Tessa carried the heavy serving tray back into that familiar private suite. Though her internal state had completely transformed, she was no longer the defenseless girl pushed through the threshold to be ridiculed, but the specific professional chosen by the guest himself. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind them, Salvatore signed a calm request for her to pull up a chair and join him, noting that he had never been comfortable, forcing the individual across from him to stand while trying to maintain a real conversation. Tessa hesitated for a beat, recognizing that sitting with a guest violated every foundational protocol of the establishment. Yet the absolute sincerity in his eyes compelled her to set her tray down and take a seat on the very edge of the chair. Salvatore then began to share a narrative with slow, deliberate movements, a history she could immediately tell had been shared with very few souls in his lifetime. He signed a question, asking if she understood why the entire city whispered that his deafness was merely an arrogant act designed to cultivate a dangerous persona. Without waiting for a response, his hands provided the answer. He intentionally let the fabrication thrive, even feeling a sense of immense relief when the public bought into it. In the brutal world he commanded, a reputation for extreme arrogance was entirely harmless, whereas the vulnerability of a physical weakness could cost a man his life. He revealed that he hadn't processed a single sound since a cataclysmic afternoon in his youth, the day a devastating bomb blast had violently ripped his father away from him, taking his sense of hearing along with it. He communicated this history with an unsettling calm, as if he were recounting a distant winter storm, entirely devoid of self-pity or theatrical exaggeration. It was simply a reality he had adjusted to live beside. He lifted a hand to gently trace the faint scar cutting across his cheekbone, signing that while the outside world looked at that mark and conjured up wild tales of cinematic underworld warfare, to him it was simply the physical residue of the day he lost everything at once and was forced to transform into an adult overnight. He explained that after the tragedy, he dedicated himself to mastering the art of lip reading, training his eyes to observe the world with such fierce intensity that no one ever suspected he was overcompensating for a missing sense. He kept the reality so profoundly hidden that only a tiny inner circle of his most trusted associates were aware of the truth, because within his syndicate, showing a weakness was equivalent to signing his own execution warrant. Tessa watched every single movement of his hands with breathless focus, realizing that the man sitting across from her was presenting her with something far more profound than standard trust. He was handing her the keys to the fortress he had spent his entire existence defending. She raised her hands to ask why he would choose to reveal such a vulnerability to a simple waitress he had only recently met. Salvatore locked his eyes onto hers, responding that it was because she was the solitary human being in over a decade to step into his presence and speak to him as an actual person, rather than a terrifying crime lord or an object of cheap pity. She hadn't altered her volume. She hadn't slowed her movements to a crawl. She hadn't offered condescending sympathy, and she hadn't shown fear. She had simply engaged with him, a rare experience he had nearly forgotten existed. As he signed those words, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a very slight, genuine smile, the absolute first smile Tessa had ever witnessed on his stoic face. It was a fleeting expression, yet it was more than enough for her to feel the heavy barriers between them shift back a little further. In that profound moment, she realized that the deep fury she had carried all week hadn't dissolved. It had merely evolved into something else, a fierce, protective hope that this man, regardless of what his identity might be in the dangerous world outside, deserved to be treated with far greater human decency than the cowards lurking behind the service door had ever shown him. In the wake of that Thursday night, a subtle transformation Tessa had never anticipated began to ripple through the restaurant. The reality that the establishment's most influential and mysterious patron had specifically demanded a single, low-ranking waitress wasn't the kind of development that could remain contained for long in an environment fueled entirely by gossip. Within a matter of days, the atmosphere among her peers shifted visibly. The dismissive, patronizing glares, previously reserved for the quiet snob, were replaced by something far more calculated. Sharp curiosity, intense scrutiny, and in several coworkers a bitter jealousy. They noted with growing irritation that every single Thursday evening, she was called exclusively into the room at the end of the hall, remaining inside far longer than any standard table service would ever require. They observed that whenever she emerged, her face carried a distinct, tranquil peace that they simply couldn't comprehend. The individual most consumed by this shift was Brett. His mean-spirited prank had backfired in spectacular fashion. Instead of breaking Tessa's spirit for a shared laugh with his friends, his cruelty had accidentally elevated her, forcing him to watch the very woman he sought to break become the exclusive confidant of the restaurant's most feared guest. It eroded his fragile ego with every passing day. To make matters worse, whenever he found himself face-to-face with Salvatore, the man wouldn't grant him so much as a glance or a word. This total erasure on his own home turf fueled a dark, toxic resentment within the manager's chest. Brett began to rely on the exact tactics small-minded people use when they cannot handle seeing someone they look down on rise above them. He began cultivating malicious rumors. At first, these were just a few suggestive remarks dropped as if by accident during the chaotic dinner rushes. In the kitchen, muttering to anyone nearby how peculiar it was that a completely unexceptional girl had suddenly managed to secure the boss's exclusive attention, hinting at what scandalous activities might be taking place behind the locked door of that private room. He strategically released those toxic, half-joking insinuations at the exact moments when the kitchen was most crowded, ensuring his phrasing remained just vague enough that he could easily backpedal and claim he was merely having a bit of harmless fun if ever confronted. Yet the words were sharp, enough to paint an incredibly ugly image of her character in the minds of the staff. Carla, who already held a deep-seated dislike for Tessa, immediately amplified the narrative, adding graphic details and pure malice to every rumor until the fabrications mutated countless times over as they passed through the mouth of every employee on the floor. Just like that, the name Tessa, a name belonging to a woman who had spent her entire life wanting nothing more than to remain completely invisible and be left in absolute peace, became the most scandalous topic of conversation in the break room. The heartbreaking irony of the situation was that the more dignified her silence remained, the more she refused to dignify the lies with an explanation, the more the toxic staff interpreted her quiet reserve as an open admission of guilt. In the middle of this suffocating environment, a single individual began to experience a profound crisis of conscience. It was Owen, the youngest busboy in the group, who had stood alongside Brett and Carla outside the doorframe that fateful Thursday night to join in on the laughter. Owen wasn't inherently an evil person. He was simply young, impressionable, and incredibly weak-willed, deeply terrified of becoming the next target of the group's isolation if he ever chose to stand out. Yet, as he watched the slander drift further and further from what he had initially categorized as harmless locker room teasing, as he listened to the systematic assassination of Tessa's dignity grow, increasingly vile, a heavy wave of guilt began to settle deep within his chest. He vividly recalled her serene expression whenever she stepped out of that private suite, remembered that throughout her entire tenure, she had done absolutely nothing to warrant such toxic treatment, and he began to see that his passive participation had helped create an absolute monster. Owen still lacked the fundamental courage required to speak out publicly. He continued to keep his head down whenever Brett dropped another disgusting remark, avoiding Tessa's eyes whenever their paths crossed on the floor. However, the heavy guilt within him continued to grow like a weed planted in the wrong soil. Although he didn't realize it yet, that slow, agonizing weight would ultimately become the precise catalyst that would change everything. For the time being, within a kitchen that grew increasingly toxic with every passing shift, Tessa pressed forward with her duties. She remained completely unaware that the firestorm of rumors Brett had intentionally lit was only in its infancy, and that very soon it would force her to make a definitive choice: to continue retreating into her historic silence, or to stand tall and establish a boundary she had spent her entire existence trying to avoid. Despite the heavy murmurs circulating outside those four walls, the Thursday encounters in the isolated room arrived with comforting regularity. Little by little, they transformed into a sanctuary of time that Tessa, though she refused to admit it even to her own heart, genuinely began to anticipate. It was the solitary space in her reality where she wasn't treated as a scuffed snob or the target of vile kitchen gossip, but simply as a human being who was fully heard. If their previous encounter had been defined by Salvatore opening up his soul to reveal the truth he guarded most fiercely. Then on this particular evening, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, Tessa felt a profound desire to reciprocate. Having witnessed him offer up his absolute truth, it felt fundamentally dishonest to continue hiding behind her own fortress. When his hands formed a question inquiring why someone of her youth had chosen to exist so completely sealed off from the rest of humanity, she sat in quiet reflection for a long interval before raising her fingers to tell her story. She shared that there had been a time in her past when she was completely different, a time when she had trusted someone so implicitly that she surrendered every secret of her life to them, viewing that relationship as an absolute sanctuary during her darkest days. Because she had placed her faith entirely in their hands, she was completely off guard when they requested to borrow every single dollar she had, painstakingly saved over countless months, funds she had set aside for a critical medical intervention for her younger brother. Then, without a single word of warning, that individual vanished into thin air with her life savings, leaving her with completely empty hands and an agonizing lesson she vowed never to endure again. She signed that the true devastation hadn't been the loss of the currency. Money was something that could always be recovered by grinding through extra shifts. Trauma that broke her spirit was the realization that she had misjudged someone so completely that the softest, most sacred space within her soul had been used by the very person she loved to inflict a mortal wound. From that day forward, she dedicated herself to constructing walls, not because she was inherently cold, but because she was absolutely terrified. She was paralyzed by the fear that if she ever permitted herself to open up to another human being again, the subsequent wound would be something she wouldn't possess the strength to survive. Salvatore followed, every single movement of her fingers without offering a single interruption, never rushing to offer empty, performative comfort or trite pieces of advice. He simply anchored her with a gaze that broadcast total, absolute comprehension. She then expanded her narrative to speak of Dany, detailing her 22-year-old brother's trade school journey and the devastating childhood fever that had altered his acoustic world forever. She explained that Dany was the absolute soul architecture behind her fluency in sign language. The money stolen from her years ago had been explicitly earmarked for his development. She shared that no matter how much tragedy this existence hurled at her feet, she had made a solemn vow to her soul that she would never allow her brother to feel isolated inside his own silence. The moment she spoke of Dany, an undeniable shift occurred in Salvatore's eyes. His posture straightened, becoming intensely focused. This was his very first introduction to the existence of the younger brother, the true explanation for why a struggling waitress possessed such breathtaking fluency in the exact language he had been forced to inhabit his entire life. He suddenly realized that her expressive hands weren't a lucky coincidence of fate, but the beautiful monument of years of quiet, unconditional love. He raised his hands to sign a sentiment that Tessa would carry engraved upon her heart for the rest of her days. He noted that the vast majority of humanity falsely believed that listening was an act performed exclusively by the ears. Yet his life had taught him better than anyone that the world was filled with. Individuals who possessed perfect hearing but could never truly comprehend another human being, while there were rare souls who existed in total silence yet could listen with greater clarity than anyone else on earth. When his hands fell still, a profound quiet settled over the room, a silence that carried absolutely no awkwardness but felt incredibly warm. Within that private suite, two individuals who had spent their entire lives hiding behind massive fortresses had just realized they were looking at one another in a way very few people ever had. Two distinct traumas from two completely different realities. One soul locked away because her vulnerability had been brutally exploited, the other profoundly isolated in the absolute center of his immense power. Yet, as their stories reflected one another, the pain didn't intensify. Remarkably, it began to ease. Tessa walked out of the room that evening carrying a sensation she hadn't felt in a long time, the realization that perhaps not every unlocked door leads directly to a new tragedy, and that perhaps there were still individuals in this universe worth stepping out from, behind her walls for, worth trusting one more time. The profound comfort Tessa carried home from that private suite was destined to be short-lived, against the toxic environment brewing at the restaurant. While she had managed to discover a space where her humanity was recognized, out on the main floor under Brett's management, The whispers had escalated from pathetic rumors into something far more dangerous. He was no longer restricting his malice to casual remarks in the kitchen. He took the step of pushing his toxic narratives into the official digital staff group chat, where every employee could read them, and no one possessed the courage to challenge him. He drafted messages explicitly, stating that the solitary explanation for an ordinary waitress like Tessa securing the exclusive favor of their most influential underworld patron was that she was trading her dignity, clinging desperately to a dangerous criminal from the syndicates to anchor away out of her impoverished server life. He wrapped those vile accusations in the cowardly armor of internet humor, punctuating the text with laughing emojis to make it appear lighthearted. But every single employee who read those words understood that he was intentionally dragging her reputation through the mud, what pushing the situation entirely beyond the boundaries of standard workplace harassment was that Brett didn't restrict his cruelty to the digital space. He began executing physical actions that left Tessa feeling intensely compromised whenever he was near. He would intentionally obstruct her path in the suffocatingly narrow corridors behind the kitchen line, forcing her to physically squeeze past his frame while making inappropriate remarks about her body in a mocking tone. Whenever she displayed visible disgust or discomfort, he would simply laugh it off loudly, claiming she was far too uptight and completely incapable of taking a simple joke. This insidious habit of transforming the target into the one who was overreacting left Tessa feeling trapped in a cage of intense fury, because he was her direct shift supervisor, the individual who held absolute dominion over her weekly scheduling and her livelihood. She understood with total clarity that if she escalated the situation to upper management, her voice would likely be the first one silenced. Crucially, Tessa wasn't the first target of his behavior. During those agonizing days, through guarded glances and fragmented conversations overheard in the locker room, she began to piece together a horrifying reality. There had been a line of young women who had occupied her position before her, all of whom had endured the exact same systematic harassment from Brett before quietly resigning without ever filing an official complaint. They had fled because everyone was desperate for a paycheck. Everyone was terrified of retaliation, and everyone understood that the word of a low-wage waitress held zero weight against a manager who was highly favored by the corporate executives. This heavy, unspoken trauma covered the entire establishment in a suffocating atmosphere that the staff simply chose to tolerate in silence. The overall morale during the long shifts began to decay. A few coworkers who had historically been entirely neutral now looked at Tessa with a painful mix of pity and avoidance, treating her as if she were a toxic liability best kept at a distance. Others swallowed Brett's narrative completely, muttering insults behind her back. Tessa, who had dedicated her entire existence to remaining completely invisible, now found herself thrust into the absolute center of the one thing she feared. Above all else, intense, malicious attention. Throughout this ordeal, Owen found himself living in an absolute psychological nightmare. He read every single disgusting text Brett posted in the forum and felt his stomach physically churn, because he possessed the absolute certainty that those words were complete fabrications. He had witnessed firsthand the quiet, flawless dignity with which Tessa had executed her duties for countless months. And he also recognized the monster hiding behind Brett's charismatic supervisor mask. The memory of that Thursday night, when he had stood outside the door, Seaman laughed along with the joke, haunted him relentlessly. The more he reflected on that moment, the more intense his self-loathing became forever, treating the systematic destruction of another human being's dignity as a source of cheap entertainment. Owen's guilt had transitioned from a vague emotional ache into a suffocating physical weight that pressed down on his lungs the moment he punched into his shift. He began quietly documenting everything, recording the dates and times of Brett's verbal and physical harassment. Even though he lacked the clarity to know what he was gathering these details for, and still lacked the courage to publicly align himself with Tessa out of fear of corporate retaliation, a fundamental shift had occurred within his soul. He could no longer fool himself into believing this was harmless fun. Deep down he recognized that a definitive moment was approaching when he would be forced to make a choice: to continue surviving as a coward in silence, or to stand tall and speak the unvarnished truth. Tessa, entering that toxic kitchen day after day surrounded by malicious glares, was also hurtling toward the moment where her endurance would reach its absolute limit. The moment where her endurance finally fractured arrived on a humid afternoon when she descended into the dim wine cellar in the back of the building to retrieve stock for the upcoming dinner rush. As she lifted a heavy wooden crate, Brett and Carla suddenly stepped into the narrow exit, blocking her path entirely. Their faces were twisted into those familiar, mocking smirks as they dropped. Another crude insinuation regarding her prolonged late-night rendezvous inside the private suite. They stood there confidently, fully expecting her to lower her gaze and squeeze past their frames in humiliated silence, just as she had always done. Instead, Tessa slammed the heavy crate of wine down onto a shelf with a resounding crash, stood perfectly straight, and for the first time in her life, locked her gray eyes directly onto Brett's. Her voice didn't crack, nor did she raise it to a scream, but it carried a slow, lethal precision that caused the smirks on their faces to instantly freeze. She informed them with absolute calm that she had been fully aware of the cruel trap they had orchestrated for her that very first Thursday night, and that she had intercepted every single disgusting rumor they had manufactured behind her back. She refused to retreat an inch. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, forcing Brett to take an awkward, clumsy step backward into the wooden wine racks. Brett opened his mouth instantly, desperately trying to laugh it off and deploy his signature defense, asking her why. She was transforming a little bit of harmless fun into a massive crisis, but Tessa cut him off with absolute authority. She looked straight through his eyes and stated that she hadn't stood her ground to debate whether her personal feelings had been hurt, because she was entirely accustomed to enduring their ignorance and could easily let it slide. What she absolutely refused to let pass, what had compelled her to stand in this cellar and speak these words, was the reality that they had exploited a human being's inability to hear as a source of cheap entertainment. She stated that they had used the phrase stone-deaf monster with a mocking cadence, treating a man's silent world as a hilarious defect, without recognizing his humanity for even a single second. She pointed out that if she hadn't happened to be fluent in sign language that evening, a completely innocent man would have been left trapped in a deeply uncomfortable isolation, transformed by a group of cowards hiding behind a door, paying into the centerpiece of a joke he couldn't even hear. She looked him dead in the eye and stated, "That isn't a joke, Brett. That is pure cruelty disguised as entertainment." Tessa's volume never escalated, yet every single syllable she uttered carried such immense weight that the entire cellar, usually vibrating with the low hum of the refrigeration units, seemed to fall into an absolute breathless silence. She pressed forward, stating that she possessed a younger brother who inhabited that exact same silent world, and that she had dedicated her entire existence to ensuring no small-minded bully would ever be permitted to view his reality as a joke. Because of that, she understood with total clarity how profoundly disgusting and unfair it was to transform a person's physical difference into raw material for personal boredom. She locked her gaze onto Carla, then back to Brett, informing them that she wasn't asking for their affection or their approval. They were entirely free to continue harboring their resentment toward her. However, she established a definitive line that they would respect from this moment on. They possessed absolutely zero right to strip another human being of their fundamental dignity, whether hers, Salvatore's, or any other employees, and transform it into a circus act to alleviate their pathetic boredom. Carla, who was historically famous for her razor-sharp tongue, found herself completely paralyzed, unable to manufacture a single word of defense. Her face drained of all color, and she averted her gaze entirely, unable to look Tessa in the eye. Brett stood frozen, the confident, mocking smirk completely vanished from his lips. He parted his mouth as if trying to salvage a shred of his shattered authority, but fell completely silent because, for the first time in his entire career, someone had possessed the immense courage to look him dead in the face and expose the raw, ugly truth of his actions. His standard excuses disintegrated into hollow air against the power of her words. Only then did Tessa register the presence of Owen, who was standing quietly near the dark entrance of the cellar. He had caught every single word of the confrontation. When her steady gaze drifted over his frame, he instantly dropped his chin, both of his ears flushing a deep crimson with intense shame. Not because she had uttered a word of accusation toward him, but because every single truth she had just unleashed had completely exposed his own spineless complicity. Tessa offered no further comment. She bent down with absolute poise, hoisted the heavy crate of wine into her arms, and strode out of the cellar, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence in which, For the first time in history, absolutely no one was laughing. In the immediate aftermath of the explosive confrontation in the wine cellar, Brett maintained a quiet profile for a handful of days. However, this sudden reserve wasn't born out of genuine remorse. It was the volatile pressure, mounting within a small-minded man who had just experienced a humiliating defeat and was desperately seeking an avenue to resurrect the false authority he believed had been stripped away. The strategy individuals of Brett's caliber typically employ to repair a fractured ego is to rely on desperate grandstanding. He began whispering to a select circle of staff within the restaurant, as well as to various acquaintances in the neighborhood bars, boasting that he was a dangerous figure who shouldn't be crossed, fabricating tall tales about his deep personal connections to Marquetti's inner circle. He claimed that the formidable Thursday night patron held immense personal respect for his management. He heavily embellished these fabrications to elevate his status in the eyes of others, completely oblivious to the reality that within the dangerous world he was using as a social shield, fabricating a relationship with the syndicate network wasn't a harmless game. His reckless boasts, migrating through various social circles across the neighborhood, eventually reached the ears of a man known as Big Mike, Salvatore's fiercely loyal second-in-command, the individual explicitly tasked with monitoring any development that could impact the reputation, security, or operational safety of the organization. To an operator of Big Mike's experience, a complete stranger migrating through the city, claiming unauthorized affiliation with their family wasn't something that could be casually overlooked, not out of a sense of insulted pride, but because it represented an extreme operational hazard. If an outsider began leveraging the Marquetti name to extort or impress others, it could easily drag the organization into legal or street complications they had zero desire to touch. Consequently, one evening as the dinner rush was winding down, two impeccably tailored gentlemen stepped through the front doors of the restaurant, moving with such calm, polite poise that absolutely no one registered their presence until they walked straight up to Brett's station. With chilling courtesy, they requested that he step out into the quiet alleyway for a brief conversation. Tessa happened to be sanitizing the glass counters near the entrance at that exact moment, granting her a front-row view of the entire interaction. She clearly witnessed the exact second the color drained completely from Brett's face as he recognized the identity of the men standing before him. They never raised their voices. They made absolutely no overt physical gestures of violence. One of the associates simply closed the physical distance, standing incredibly close to Brett as he delivered a sequence of low, even sentences that Tessa couldn't fully intercept over the ambient noise. Horizontal constraints prevented him from moving away. However, she could track the physical devastation of those words, manifest on Brett's features second by second. His signature arrogance evaporated into nothingness, replaced by the broken posture of a man who has just realized he has been carelessly playing with a lethal force whose true weight he couldn't possibly comprehend. The gentleman gently reminded him of a single, unyielding reality. There were certain names in this city that carried too much weight to be borrowed for pathetic acts of social grandstanding. He stated that they had arrived tonight, out of total respect to ensure the boundary was perfectly clear and handled politely, expressing total confidence that there would be absolutely no requirement for a second rendezvous. Then, with the exact same quiet grace with which they had arrived, they offered a polite nod of farewell, spun around, and melted into the city streets. They left Brett rooted to the concrete alleyway, his face completely bloodless and his hands visibly trembling. The entire encounter had unfolded within a span of mere minutes without a single chaotic sound or aggressive display of force, yet it left behind a profound, terrifying chill in the air that was far more frightening than any screaming match could ever be. Tessa, watching from the safety of a shadowed corner, stood completely frozen, her cleaning cloth gripped tightly in her hand. This marked her very first time witnessing the reality of the dangerous world that stood directly behind the gentle man she sat with every Thursday night in that private suite. She realized with a jolt of fear that the warmth, humor, and vulnerability he displayed within those four walls represented only one hemisphere of his existence. The opposite hemisphere was a terrifying architecture of absolute power capable of reducing an arrogant bully like Brett to a trembling wreck with nothing more than a few whispered sentences. What caused a cold shiver to run down her spine wasn't the threat of physical violence, because absolutely no violence had occurred. It was the sheer weight of his silent influence. The horrifying reality that the mere mention of a name was enough to command total absolute fear. Tessa stood in the shadows and for the first time felt a wave of intense hesitation. Aligning herself with that man didn't simply mean cozy evenings and beautiful conversations carried by the movement of their hands. It meant entering an orbit governed by a terrifying set of hidden laws completely foreign to her reality. A heavy, dark question slipped into her thoughts for the very first time, a question she was profoundly terrified to answer. Could a simple waitress, whose entire life was anchored around protecting a vulnerable younger brother, safely exist within the gravity of a world like that? That night, her walk back to the apartment felt intensely long, with the shadow of that unresolved question weighing far more heavily on her shoulders than any mountain of medical bills or toxic kitchen gossip ever had. That night, sleep completely evaded Tessa. She unlocked the door to her south side apartment long after midnight, slipping inside with her habitual caution to ensure she wouldn't disturb Dany's rest. Yet, instead of instantly collapsing into bed from pure physical exhaustion after enduring back-to-back shifts, she sat down silently on the very edge of her mattress in the dark. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of hot tea she had prepared hours earlier, completely forgotten until it had gone entirely cold. The terrifying image from the restaurant alleyway replayed on a loop behind her eyes, refusing to grant her a moment of peace. The quiet nature of the intervention was precisely what made her shiver than the reality that two completely calm men merely had to stand in proximity and speak in whispers to turn an arrogant manager into a trembling coward. That invisible, absolute control now saturated her thoughts, with a profound dread she couldn't fully articulate, setting her heart to a frantic pace. She visualized Salvatore. She remembered the profound comfort of their Thursday night dialogues, the rare warmth of his smile and the deep, total respect with which he anchored his eyes onto her face whenever she signed. Then, her mind violently collided that beautiful image with the terrifying reality she had just witnessed in the alley. For the first time, those two irreconcilable identities crashed into one another within her soul. The elegant gentleman in the private suite and the ruthless syndicate leader commanding the city's underworld were the exact same human being. Tessa realized with a wave of panic that she had only been permitted to see one hemisphere of his life, the half he had consciously chosen to reveal to her, while the hidden hemisphere she had accidentally brushed against was a hazardous ecosystem where she possessed absolutely no business existing. However, the realization that turned her blood to ice wasn't a fear for her own safety. It was the realization of the threat to Dany. The thought of her younger brother struck her chest with such sudden, violent force that her lungs seized, and she cast a panicked look toward the cracked door of his small bedroom. Her 22-year-old brother, the sweet boy she had sacrificed her entire youth to shield from the harsh realities of the world, who navigated an existence with far fewer acoustic frequencies, and who consequently required just a little more protection than everyone else. She wondered with a creeping horror whether, by allowing herself to drift deeper into Salvatore's powerful orbit, she was inadvertently exposing her innocent brother to a world governed by lethal rules he knew absolutely nothing about. The mere thought that her personal emotional choices could somehow magnetize danger toward his life was enough to make her feel physically ill. If this existence of constant hardship and loss had hammered one absolute truth into Tessa's soul, it was this: she could survive losing anything: her life savings, her capacity to trust, her personal peace. But she could never survive losing Dany. He was her absolute gravity, the solitary explanation for why she forced her eyes open every morning and pushed her calloused hands through endless double shifts. He was the only human being left on Earth who waited for her arrival, leaving a scrap of paper resting beside a cold pot of rice. The realization that she might jeopardize his sanctuary, simply because her lonely heart had begun to lean toward a man who commanded such a dangerous world, filled her with a profound sense of self-loathing. She sat motionless in the dark for hours, not calculating strategic advantages or financial losses, not measuring abstract concepts of right and wrong, but listening entirely to the most primal, defensive instinct screaming from the depths of her soul to retreat immediately. The instinct demanded that she fortify her walls, build her fortress even higher, and sever the connection completely before it was too late to protect her small home. The urge was so overwhelming that at one point, she physically reached for her phone, determined to compose a text message that would permanently establish an unbridgeable distance between them. Yet her fingers froze over the screen. She had absolutely no idea what to write. She stared out the window pane where the amber street lamps cast long, fractured shadows across her floorboards, experiencing a profound hesitation she had never felt since their introductory meeting. Salvatore, who had evolved into an intoxicating mystery she desperately wanted to solve, a sanctuary she believed she could finally trust, had suddenly transformed into the manifestation of a world that left her deeply weary. When the dawn began to break over the city grid, casting the first gray light of a new day over the streets below, Tessa was still sitting motionless on the edge of her bed, her hands anchoring the cold mug of tea, her heart completely tangled in a profound dread that had yet to take a clear shape, knowing only that a fundamental boundary had shifted, and that the Thursday nights ahead would never be simple again. While Tessa was enduring her private, sleepless torment on the south side, an entirely different sequence of events was quietly unfolding across the city, completely hidden from her awareness. From the exact moment Salvatore had begun investing his attention in the waitress who possessed the unique ability to speak his silent language, he had issued a quiet command to Big Mike to launch an investigation into the true explanation behind her sudden assignment to his room on that initial Thursday night. He was a man whose survival depended on never believing in random coincidences, and his lethal instincts proved entirely correct. Within a brief window of time, Big Mike dismantled the entire narrative and presented his master with the unvarnished, ugly truth. He revealed that Tessa's introductory appearance in the private suite wasn't a standard scheduling routine, but the architecture of a malicious prank engineered by Brett and his inner circle to humiliate her for their personal amusement. They had anticipated a scene of cruel rejection, completely blind to the profound, cosmic connection they were about to trigger. Big Mike went on to detail the vile, slanderous rumors Brett had systematically disseminated through the workplace forum to assassinate her character in the wake of that meeting. When Salvatore finished absorbing the report, his stoic features betrayed absolutely zero physical emotion. However, a terrifying, absolute stillness settled over his frame. He understood with total clarity that the rare woman he valued, above all else, the solitary human being in a decade who had approached him as an actual person, had been brought into his existence through a cruel joke targeting the exact physical vulnerability he spent his life hiding. He recognized that throughout these past weeks, she had been quietly absorbing the impact of those toxic rumors without uttering a single syllable of complaint or requesting his intervention. The subsequent Thursday night arrived, and when Tessa stepped into the private suite, her heart still intensely tangled in the profound anxiety of her sleepless nights, she instantly registered a transformation in the atmosphere. He didn't offer the gentle smile that had become their habitual greeting in recent weeks. He anchored his intense gaze onto her face for a long, silent interval before lifting his hands. What his fingers began to sign caused her breath to catch completely in her throat. He informed her with absolute calm that he had secured total clarity on everything. He knew about the malicious prank engineered that first evening. He knew the details of Brett's actions, and he knew the exact nature of the disgusting rumors the manager had manufactured to destroy her dignity. He expressed a profound fury that she had been forced to absorb that toxic environment, entirely alone this whole time. Then, with a chilling serenity that was far more terrifying than an explosive display of rage, his hands delivered an ultimatum. He stated that she was no longer required to tolerate a single second of that abuse. All she had to do was offer a single nod of her head, and he would personally ensure Brett vanished from her existence permanently, guaranteeing the man would never dare open his mouth to utter her name for the rest of his days. He offered absolutely zero explanation regarding the mechanics of how this would be achieved, nor did he need to. The sharp, absolute precision of his physical Tessa completely paralyzed. She stood rooted to the carpet inside the room that had recently evolved into the safest, warmest sanctuary in her reality. For the very first time, she felt an immense, unbridgeable distance manifest between herself and the man sitting before her. He was offering her a manifestation of absolute power she had never held in her entire existence, the authority to erase her tormentor from reality with nothing more than a silent gesture of agreement. Some fractured part of her soul, the part that was deeply exhausted by a lifetime of systemic unfairness, worn down to the bone by toxic rumors, and cornered by workplace harassment, trembled for a fraction of a second at the sheer temptation of that offer. Just one single heartbeat where she visualized the intoxicating relief of being liberated from Brett's cruelty once and for all. Yet, immediately following that heartbeat, came a profound wave of absolute terror, directed at her own reflection. She suddenly realized she was standing at a critical moral intersection she had never anticipated. On one side lay the alluring path to be permanently absolved of her abuser, through the terrifying mechanics of the underworld. And on the opposite side stood a fundamental question regarding what definition of human being she would become if she accepted that choice. If she agreed that another person, regardless of how cruel or toxic they might be, could be disposed of in a manner she didn't even possess the courage to visualize, she would be fracturing something sacred within herself. She locked her gray eyes onto Salvatore's, looking deep into the gaze that was patiently waiting for her verdict. She recognized with sudden clarity that this crossroad transcended the issue of Brett. It was a definitive choice regarding her own identity, a measure of how far she would permit her historical trauma and current exhaustion to warp her soul. She parted her lips, desperately wanting to articulate the storm within her, but found her voice completely hollow. She raised her hands to sign a solitary request. She needed him to grant her a brief window of time to process everything. She then turned and exited the room, carrying an emotional weight far more suffocating than the one she had carried through the threshold. Throughout the 4 subsequent days, Tessa didn't transmit a single digital message to Salvatore, not out of a desire to execute a tactical withdrawal or punish him, but because she genuinely possessed zero clarity on what to articulate when her internal world remained a chaotic storm of unresolved dilemmas. She executed her daily routine like an automated machine, punching into her shifts, returning to the apartment, preparing meals, and sitting across from Dany. Yet, her thoughts never ceased circling around his terrifying proposition. If the initial sleepless night after witnessing the alleyway intervention had been fueled by a purely primitive, instinctive terror, these subsequent days operated under a different rule set. The initial panic had subsided, leaving behind a far heavier burden, a deep, intellectual war within her conscience that she couldn't escape. Initially, her logical mind argued that the safest, most pragmatic strategy was to execute a total retreat, to quietly sever her connection to Salvatore, allow the entire relationship to cool down, and fade back into the background. She reasoned that if she permanently stepped out of his gravity, her existence would beautifully revert to its historic normalcy. She would once again become the comfortably invisible waitress. The workplace rumors would eventually starve and die when there was no longer any data to fuel the fire. Most importantly, Dany's sanctuary would remain completely unblemished, safely removed from the hidden laws she had glimpsed in the dark. That trajectory sounded incredibly wise, safe, and protective. It effectively anesthetized the terrified chambers of her heart. Yet, every single time she attempted to permanently commit to that exit strategy, a profound hitch occurred deep within her soul, refusing to let her rest. It wasn't until the twilight of the 4th day, as she sat quietly by the glass window pane after Dany had drifted off to sleep, that her consciousness finally pierced through the fog to touch the exact root of her torment, granting her the ability to name it. She suddenly realized that if she chose to silently evaporate from Salvatore's existence, out of pure fear without offering a single word of explanation, she would be executing the exact same injustice she fiercely despised in Brett and the rest of the staff. She would be dictating his narrative for him, completely cutting him out of a choice he held a fundamental human right to participate in. Brett and his toxic circle had transformed him into an inanimate pawn for their cruel joke without bothering to ask him a single question, arranging the details of his life behind his back as if he lacked the fundamental right to speak for his own reality. Now, if she chose to vanish into the shadows simply to soothe her personal panic, she too would be treating him as a problematic equation to be solved rather than an actual human being who deserved the dignity of an honest conversation. That sudden epiphany filled her soul with a profound sense of shame. Over the course of their Thursday night dialogues, she had taken a quiet pride in believing she was fundamentally different from the wolves who had historically exploited him, that she was the rare individual who truly recognized his humanity. Yet here she was, on the precipice of executing the exact action that would strip him of his right to be recognized as a person. She unraveled a second truth, one that cut even deeper. She realized that the definitive question demanding an answer wasn't about Brett, nor was it about whether she should authorize Salvatore to deploy his power. It was a question regarding the architecture of her own soul. If she offered that fatal nod of agreement, if she permitted her exhaustion and trauma to lead her into accepting that another human being could be handled, through the brutal mechanics of the streets, she would be permanently altering her own frequency. She would transform into someone who leverages another person's capacity for violence to execute her own personal vengeance. If she crossed that moral line, how could she possibly argue? She was any different from the bullies who routinely used raw strength to crush the vulnerable souls beneath them? Dany remained anchored in the absolute center of every thought. Yet this time, she visualized his reflection not through the lens of paralyzing fear, but through the lens of a profound moral responsibility. She wondered that if one day, as Dany grew older and discovered that his sister had once stood before a critical moral intersection of this magnitude, what legacy did she want him to witness her choose? Did she want to model for her brother the truth that human dignity must be fiercely defended, even when it belongs to an individual who has caused you profound pain? Or did she want to teach him that the moment a person secures enough raw power in their hands, they are granted total authority to obliterate anyone who has ever compromised their peace? The moment that question clarified itself within her mind, Tessa possessed her absolute answer. Not because it was the easy trajectory or the secure path, but because it was the solitary resolution that would allow her to look straight into her brother's beautiful eyes and into her own reflection without turning away in disgust. The very next morning, she placed her hand on her phone, and for the first time in 4 agonizing days, she transmitted a brief digital message to Salvatore. She stated that she needed to see him immediately, explaining that there was a truth she was compelled to deliver. Not through the cold medium of written text, but directly with the movement of her own hands, inside the private suite where their story had first begun. Salvatore's digital response arrived almost instantaneously. Consequently, the following evening, Tessa stepped through the threshold of that familiar private suite once more, though this time her hands were completely free of a serving tray. She entered the room purely as herself, carrying an architecture of truth she had spent 4 days learning how to articulate. He was already seated at the head of the table waiting for her arrival. As she secured the lock on the heavy door and slid into the seat opposite him, he anchored her with an intense, quiet concentration, intuitively sensing that the concepts about to be delivered would carry immense weight. Tessa took a deep, grounding breath and raised her calloused hands into the space between them. She initiated her dialogue by offering him her profound gratitude. She signed that she recognized his terrifying offer had been born out of a fierce, protective desire to defend her honor, noting that across a lifetime, saturated with betrayal and loss, absolutely no one had ever stood up to shield her in that manner. Precisely because his protective intent was so precious to her, she was compelled to match it with total, unyielding honesty. She locked her gray eyes directly into his and delivered her absolute refusal. She communicated with total clarity that she did not want him to execute any form of retaliation against Brett. She clarified that this decision didn't arise from a place of superficial forgiveness or weakness, but from a fierce desire to preserve the integrity of who they were to one another. She looked deep into his eyes, explaining that on the fateful night she was pushed into his room, they had both been reduced to utilitarian objects designed for someone else's sick amusement. If she chose to accept his offer to crush her abuser now, she would be executing the exact same violation, transforming his living existence into a mere weapon to validate her personal anger. She formed her gestures with slow, absolute precision to ensure he intercepted the weight of every movement. "You are not a weapon for my rage, Salvatore. You are a human being, and I refuse to treat you as anything less than that." The moment that sentence concluded, Tessa tracked a faint, profound shift manifest in the depths of Salvatore's gaze, yet she refused to halt her momentum. Recognizing that true honesty demands total completion, she signed openly about the terrifying night of insomnia she had endured after witnessing his 2 associates intervene with Brett in the alleyway. She didn't attempt to conceal her intense fear from him. She admitted with total vulnerability that the display had deeply frightened her, forcing her to see the reality of the dangerous world that stood directly at his back, an ecosystem governed by lethal, hidden rules she didn't comprehend and didn't know if she possessed the courage to exist around. She spoke openly of Dany, sharing her terrifying dread that if she drifted deeper into his gravity, that dark world might one day reach out its fingers to touch the innocent younger brother she had sacrificed her youth to protect. She signed that, there had been a definitive moment, during her days of isolation when she had fully resolved to execute a silent retreat, to permanently vanish from his existence, without a word so that her small home could return to total peace. Yet she explained that she ultimately realized that executing a silent disappearance would be a total violation of his dignity, a way of dictating his narrative behind his back, exactly like the monsters who had historically exploited his silence. She refused to become a wolf. Therefore, instead of retreating into the shadows like a coward, she had chosen to walk into this room and lay every raw truth of her soul bare before him, both her deep affection and her terrifying anxieties, thereby returning to him the fundamental human right he should have always possessed. She signed that she could not calculate the future of whatever connection existed between them entirely alone. He held an absolute right to know exactly who she was, what she feared, and what she desired. After absorbing the full weight of those realities, he would be the individual who held the choice to decide if he truly wanted to step into the modest, complicated life of a struggling waitress with a vulnerable younger brother and a heart intensely accustomed to building massive walls. Concurrently, she too would make her own choice regarding whether she possessed the immense bravery required to step into his powerful orbit. Whatever the ultimate verdict was destined to be, it had to emerge from a foundation of total truth, never from a place of fearful avoidance. She lowered her hands back to her lap after surrendering everything, experiencing an extraordinary, weightless relief, the unique peace of a human being who, for the first time in an eternity, had gathered the courage to present her whole authentic identity, both her towering strengths and her most fragile fractures, before another soul without a single armor piece remaining. The private suite dissolved into a deep stillness, a silence, entirely unique from any they had, historical shared, thick with emotional resonance, because every single card in their hands had just been turned face up on the table. Tessa sat there, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting to see what the powerful man across the table would choose to do with the raw truth she had just placed in his hands. Salvatore sat in total, unyielding stillness for a massive interval after Tessa's hands came to rest, so long that a wave of intense panic began to creep into her thoughts, fearing she had overstepped her boundaries, fearing she had just shattered the solitary language he knew how to deploy. Yet when he finally raised his hands into the space between them, the concepts his fingers began to shape caused her to completely lose her breath. He signed that across the entire span of his existence. From the cataclysmic afternoon he lost his father and was forced to transform into a ruthless adult, overnight to inherit the empire he now commanded. Absolutely no human being had ever approached his presence without bearing one of two motivations: total fear or insatiable greed. People entered his orbit either because they trembled before his lethal authority and wanted to placate his rage, or because they recognized the vast architecture of his wealth and power and wanted to execute a strategic transaction to extract a piece for themselves. He had existed for over a decade entirely surrounded by wolves who perceived him either as a destructive force to be managed or an asset to be exploited, so long, his hands signed, that he had nearly forgotten he was a human, being who could be engaged on an entirely different frequency. He confessed that when he initially offered to permanently erase Brett from her reality, a massive part of his mind assumed that was the exact currency she desired, because that was the solitary dialect his harsh universe knew how to speak. When an entity inflicts a wound, you obliterate them from the board. That was the unyielding protocol. That was the mechanics of how everything in his reality had operated for 15 years. Yet, she had just executed an action absolutely no soul in his lifetime had ever attempted. She had rejected his immense power, not because she lacked the need for protection, but because she fiercely desired to defend his personal dignity. She had looked past his terrifying empire and recognized a human being, worthy of fundamental respect, refusing to reduce him to a mere instrument of violence. He formed his gestures with profound emotion, signing that the exact moment she informed him he wasn't her knife, she had gifted him something that neither his billions nor his terrifying syndicates could ever dream of, purchasing for him the extraordinary, forgotten sensation of being perceived as a whole human being. He paused for a long heartbeat, his eyes tracking her features, before signing his ultimate verdict. He would not lay a single finger on Brett, not because the manager deserved a shred of mercy, but because she deserved to have a partner at her side who refused to translate every human conflict into blood, dread, and violence, He stated that if remaining within her orbit required him to study an entirely new way of navigating this existence, completely distinct from the brutal strategy he had historically relied upon, he was entirely prepared to execute that transformation. In that exact moment, Tessa locked her eyes onto his and witnessed a total, unshielded warmth radiating from the very gaze the entire city whispered was as cold as absolute ice. True justice for Brett's actions, as fate would beautifully arrange, didn't emerge from the dark mechanics of the underworld she had so fiercely dreaded, but from the avenue she least anticipated. During those precise days of internal crisis, Owen, the young busboy who had caught the entire raw confrontation in the wine cellar and had carried a suffocating weight of guilt for countless weeks, finally discovered the fundamental courage he had lacked for so long. He arrived at a profound realization that his passive silence throughout the ordeal had been a form of active complicity, and that if he continued to lower his chin and avert his gaze, he would permanently remain the cowardly, broken version of himself he utterly despised. Consequently, he quietly organized a comprehensive dossier of evidence, compiling the explicit, slanderous text logs Brett had systematically posted in the staff forum, documenting the precise dates and times he had witnessed the physical intimidation of other employees, and gathering the contact details of the young women who had resigned in silence because they couldn't endure the manager's abuse. He then marched that entire dossier directly to the corporate senior executives, presenting the data through the official human resources protocol without attempting to shield his own passive role in the introductory prank. He fully accepted that he might face immediate termination, provided the absolute truth was finally dragged into the light. Faced with an undeniable mountain of concrete digital evidence and the devastating testimony of an eyewitness who possessed the immense bravery to step forward, the upper restaurant corporate management could no longer look the other way, as they historically had with scattered, unverified complaints. An immediate, comprehensive internal investigation was launched, and Brett's systematic harassment, which he had successfully camouflaged for years beneath the cowardly shield of workplace humor, was finally exposed to the corporate light for exactly what it was: an absolute liability and pure malice. When Tessa discovered from Owen during a quiet shift change that he was the individual who had spearheaded the entire report, she anchored her gaze onto his face for a long interval before offering a small, meaningful nod. Not a nod of cheap, immediate forgiveness, but a profound recognition that a flawed young man had chosen to execute the moral trajectory late rather than never. In that beautiful moment, she understood a great truth: real justice, the kind of absolute justice that permits human beings to lift their chins and breathe freely, never emerges from a place of terrifying dread or crushing power. It emerges entirely from the quiet courage of ordinary souls who are willing to identify what is wrong and stand unyielding on the side of truth. The corporate internal investigation concluded with absolute precision. Brett was summarily terminated by the restaurant ownership through the standard legal protocol, completely devoid of any cinematic, dramatic screaming matches, but simply manifesting as the absolute, inevitable consequence of his own actions. Once the light of truth was cast over his history, he departed the premises far more quietly than he had ever conducted himself during his tenure, with absolutely zero employees left for him to intimidate, and no powerful syndicate names left for him to borrow for his pathetic grandstanding. When his form passed through the exit doors for the final time, Tessa experienced zero sense of petty triumph and zero waves of pity. Her soul registered only a profound, beautiful relief, the unique lightness of a human being who has just had a crushing mountain lifted from her chest after carrying its weight for far too long. Carla, in the wake of Brett's sudden termination, became completely quiet on the floor, the sharp, toxic remarks she historically threw behind. Tessa's back vanished entirely from the kitchen culture, not because her heart had miraculously transformed into a sanctuary of kindness overnight, but because the systemic support structure for her cruelty had been permanently erased from the environment. She chose to maintain an absolute distance, actively redirecting her path to avoid matching eyes with Tessa. Whenever their duties crossed, Tessa required absolutely nothing more than that. She had never harbored a desire for their affection or their friendship. She merely demanded that the definitive moral boundary she had established in the wine cellar be absolutely respected, and now it was being executed flawlessly. The individual who underwent the most profound transformation was Owen. After demonstrating the immense courage required to deliver the truth to corporate. He didn't transform into a celebrated hero among the remaining staff. In fact, a few coworkers looked at him with cold disapproval, irritated that he had dared to fracture the kitchen's unspoken rule set of passive silence. Yet Owen himself was a completely different human being. He clocked into his shifts, standing noticeably straighter, no longer dropping his chin or avoiding personal interactions out of a sense of intense self-loathing. Began approaching Tessa with total unvarnished respect. On occasion, he would even hesitantly sign a simple question, asking her for insights into the basic mechanics of sign language, demonstrating, in his awkward, sincere way, a desire to genuinely comprehend the silent world. He had once carelessly transformed into a joke. Tessa didn't rush to embrace him into her inner circle, but she refused to treat him with cold hostility either. She possessed the wisdom to understand that a young soul who knows how to acknowledge an ugly mistake and actively sweat to correct it deserves a fair chance at evolution. As for her relationship with Salvatore, the connection between them in the wake of that monumental evening didn't suddenly transform into a cinematic, flawless romance saturated with dramatic declarations. It unfolded with extreme care and slow deliberation, exactly the way two highly guarded human beings who are intensely accustomed to building fortresses around their hearts would navigate their way toward one another. They continued their Thursday night rendezvous, continuing to communicate with the movement of their hands within the quiet private suite, but now the space was completely devoid of hidden laws or unvoiced anxieties. There was one specific action Salvatore executed during those subsequent weeks that Tessa would carry inside her memory for the rest of her days. He held total clarity regarding Dany's existence, knew the details of her brother's silence, and was fully aware of the life savings. She had been cruelly deceived. Out of years prior, although he commanded an empire of immense wealth and could easily have completely erased every single dollar of her mounting medical bills with a single telephone call to his accountants, he intentionally chose not to do. That he possessed a mind far too perceptive and respectful to execute such a blunt gesture. He understood with absolute clarity that lifting her financial burdens through a display of raw wealth would inadvertently warp the frequency of their connection, transforming her into an indebted dependent rather than a proud partner standing beside him as a total equal. He recognized that those old hospital bills represented a mountain Tessa fiercely desired to summit through her own labor, preserving her personal sweat and independent dignity. Instead, the solitary action he chose to execute was to elegantly open a door. He introduced Dany to a highly specialized, completely free sign language academy tailored for young adults, a facility located at an exceptional community center he had historically supported. It was a space where Dany could elevate his trade communication skills, interact with peers navigating identical realities, and discover a rich, vibrant community of his own. Salvatore didn't deploy financial leverage or use underworld intimidation to secure the spot. He simply presented Tessa with the documentation regarding the facility, and then stepped back completely, leaving the choice entirely in her and Dany's hands to decide if they desired to cross the threshold. Tessa understood that this action represented the highest definition of authentic human respect, not the glittering, condescending rescue act that reduces the beneficiary to a state of perpetual gratitude, but the elegant act of depositing choice back into their hands, trusting completely that they possessed the strength and character to walk forward under their own power. Concurrently, what she beautifully unraveled across those evolving weeks was the reality that Salvatore was consciously shifting his own orbit. He began sharing distinct blueprints for his future, strategic trajectories that existed completely outside the dark underworld architecture he had historically inherited. He spoke with his hands about systematically transitioning his capital toward totally transparent, legitimate commercial enterprises, meticulously untangling his operations from ancient street obligations one deliberate step at a time. He didn't make empty, cinematic promises to morph into a completely unblemished saint overnight, because they both possessed the maturity to know that reality doesn't function under such naive rule sets. However, the definitive trajectory he was pursuing was more than enough for Tessa to see that the man who had historically existed in total isolation in the center of his immense power was actively searching for a path toward the light. She began to dare to dream that perhaps, just perhaps, she and Dany would eventually become permanent features of the beautiful future he was beginning to construct. A handful of beautiful months drifted past, and on a crisp Thursday night that perfectly mirrored so many Thursday nights before it, Tessa once more stepped through the threshold of the private dining suite at the very end of the hallway. Yet, as she stood within the room this evening, the reality of her life had transformed so profoundly from that introductory encounter that she occasionally wondered if the woman standing there was truly the same terrified girl who had once been shoved into the room as a joke. Her hands were completely free of a serving tray. She entered the space purely as an expected, deeply valued partner. Salvatore was already seated at his usual spot, instantly lifting his head to track her, approach with a gaze she had come to know with absolute intimacy. The very gaze the entire city had once falsely rumored to be as cold as absolute ice, but to her had evolved into the warmest, safest sanctuary on earth. As she slid into the seat directly across from him, her gray eyes accidentally drifted toward the narrow seam in the heavy door leading back out to the service corridor, the tiny pane where, countless months ago, 3 mocking faces had pressed close to the glass, greedily waiting to witness her emotional destruction. The seam that had historically served as the stage for a wave of systematic cruelty camouflaged as workplace humor. Tonight, it was merely an ordinary crack in a wooden door frame. Absolutely no one lurked in the shadows behind it. No malicious eyes peeked through the pane. No, echoes of cruel laughter vibrated through the wood. It had returned to its humble, utilitarian reality. A simple architectural line marking the private, sacred sanctuary of 2 human beings. Tessa arrived at a profound realization. The most massive transformation hadn't occurred within the physical dimensions of the suite itself, but within the hearts of the 2 people occupying it. Salvatore tracked the trajectory of her gaze toward the door frame and comprehended her thoughts instantly. He raised his hands into the warm space between them and signed a brief, beautiful sentence. He confessed that for 15 years, he had fooled himself into believing this isolated room was the safest sanctuary he possessed, simply because it was private, and no one held the ability to reach his ears there. Yet his life had taught him that the suite had only truly transformed into a sanctuary from the exact moment she chose to walk through the door. That elegant sentiment caused a beautiful, unburdened smile to illuminate Tessa's features, the complete, radiant smile of a human being who has finally discovered a space where she no longer has to build walls. They sat together in the beautiful room, their fingers shaping concepts in the absolute, total stillness of the space. Not a single vocalized sound passed between their lips. Yet Tessa had never felt more deeply, thoroughly heard in her entire existence. Outside those walls, the chaotic city of Chicago continued its loud, relentless symphony. Car horns blaring, sirens echoing, and hurried footsteps pounding across the concrete grid. Outside, there still existed a massive, complicated world from which Salvatore was carefully, step by step, untangling his soul so he could move forward into a brighter reality. Yet, inside this small, quiet room existing between 2 souls who had spent their lives hiding behind fortresses, there was only a profound silence. It was, without question, the most beautiful silence she had ever experienced in her life. Not the cold silence of abandonment, trauma, or things left unsaid, but the sacred silence shared by 2 human beings who comprehend one another's souls so completely that vocalized sound is no longer necessary. The cruel prank that had once been engineered by cowards to reduce her to an object of public ridicule had beautifully mutated into a reality none of the architects could ever have imagined. By accident, their small-minded malice had acted as the precise compass, guiding 2 of the loneliest, most isolated souls in the city to discover one another. The extraordinary narrative of Tessa and Salvatore, which had initiated its first chapter with a scheme explicitly designed to butcher human dignity, ultimately evolved into an unyielding, magnificent proof of the exact opposite truth, that human dignity, when fiercely protected and honored, possesses the absolute power to heal the deepest fractures and transform the very things that seem entirely impossible. If this narrative has touched the deep chambers of your soul today, please take a moment to press the like button. Share this video with the individuals in your life who you believe genuinely need to be reminded of this truth. And remember to subscribe to our channel so we can continue to gather together to listen to more meaningful, deeply moving narratives every single day. We would truly love to discover your personal reflections regarding Tessa and Salvatore's journey. What specific chapter of their story caused your heart to reflect the most? Please leave a comment below and share your authentic feelings from deep within your soul, because every single line you contribute is incredibly precious to our team and grants us the profound inspiration required to keep telling Kinder more beautiful stories. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for investing your valuable time to listen until the very final second. May you and the beautiful people you love always be blessed with abundant health, a deeply joyful existence, total peace within your soul, and a gentle calm in every single day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to welcoming you back in the next narrative. Subscribe,